Hello and welcome back. We are moving up the brain. We just got done covering the brain stem. This video is going to cover the cerebellum and the diencephalon, so the next two regions of the human brain. So let's jump right in. So we're first going to take a look at the cerebellum. It is called a little brain because early anatomists saw our big cerebrum up here and then this smaller little wrinkly structure towards the back. They're like, oh, that's a little brain. So we call it the cerebellum. I don't know if that's how the story goes, but I want to believe that's how it looked, how it sounded. So first we'll take a look at the anatomical features that we can see with the cerebellum, and then we'll take a look at kind of the functions of the different regions. So looking at this posterior view here, we can see it's kind of wrinkly, but it's not quite gyry and sulky wrinkly. It almost looks like freshly ground meat, almost like that would go through a grinder or something. Those little ridges are called folia. So not gyri or gyrus, but a folia. And then there are some hemispheres. So because we have one on each half, so our left and our right hemispheres. And then the separator isn't really a fissure. It's kind of this ridge of material called a vermis. Vermis actually means worm-like, so I guess it kind of looks like a worm, maybe more like a caterpillar, but that's the vermis, is the ridge that separates your left and right hemispheres. We also have lobes in our cerebellum, so we have our anterior lobe and our posterior lobe separated by a fissure. It's a little bit harder to see the orientation of an anterior and posterior in that posterior view, but if we look here, here's that fissure. Here we can see the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. So I would have said superior and inferior lobe, but I wasn't around naming these things. So just, I guess the anterior lobe is a little bit more superior than the posterior lobe. So those are kind of the major anatomical features that we can see superficially. And then taking a slice, if we're going to slice right through that vermis there, we can see there is a cerebellar cortex. Now, we haven't really used the term cortex yet. Cortex is an outer layer. So in the cerebellum, and we'll also see it in the cerebrum, there is a cortex. So here's the cerebellar cortex, which is the gray matter. We do know what gray matter is, or if you remember, gray matter is referring to the cell bodies. So all of the neurons, those cell bodies, are found going around the very outer edge of all of those wrinkles of the folia and the fissures and things. And then the white matter inside the cerebellum is called the arbor vitae. So remember, white matter is a collection of all the myelinated axons. And then there's a nucleus, which is just, nucleus means center, so it's just the center of the cerebellum. So if you remember when we were in 231 and we were talking about the structure of multipolar neurons, and I mentioned how they are what are called Purkinje neurons in the cerebellum that have crazy dendrites. There's a picture of this in your lab manual. These Purkinje cells that are found in the cerebellar cortex of the cerebellum, those are the ones that can receive upwards of 200,000 synapses on their cell body and dendrites. Those are the ones that are found in the gray matter in that cerebellar cortex that monitor and process all this incoming information and then send out motor commands to help regulate your body position and balance and things. Oh, I'm wearing my eye brain science shirt today. This is normally what I wear when I'm lecturing on the brain in a real person class, so I went ahead and put it on today. All right, so those are the structures of kind of the cerebellar hemispheres itself. But remember when we talked about in the pons, there were these three kind of things that were stuck to the back wall of the pons, and I said we're going to talk about those when we get to the cerebellum. Well, that's what we're going to talk about. These are called cerebellar peduncles. Again, we see that word peduncle. If you remember, we had the cerebral peduncles in the midbrain that look like celery stalks. Those are our peduncles, cerebral peduncles. In the cerebellum and pons, kind of cerebellum pons combo, we have middle, superior, and inferior cerebellar peduncles. These are connector tracts, all right? So tracts are myelinated axons, they're like nerves. So superior peduncles link the cerebellum with the midbrain, right? So that's going to be going up here. The middle midbrain and diencephalon, all the stuff that's kind of high in the cerebrum. In middle connects to the pons. So the middle goes to the pons, which kind of makes sense. And the inferior goes to the medulla. That's a really bad arrow. So these peduncles, again, tracts of white matter, myelinated axons, sending information superiorly with the superior peduncle, anteriorly to the pons with the middle, and inferiorly to the medulla and spinal cord with the inferior. So the directionalities really make sense. And yes, that's your cerebellum. So general functions besides, transmitting that information is that cerebellum is really important for regulating your body's position, muscle tone, movement. It allows for it to take in all of the sensory information, auditory information, equilibrium information, stretch receptors in your tendons and your muscles to keep you from falling over, basically part of it. For a comparison of normal to abnormal function, when people consume lots of alcohol, alcohol inhibits the neurons of the cerebellum. So think about or imagine, you can see somebody who is highly intoxicated, how their body is in relationship to their three-dimensional space. They're walking, their gait is all off, they're off balance, they might be having to lean up against things, otherwise they'd fall over. They just don't have a good perception of where their body is in three-dimensional space. That's the role of the cerebellum. So when it's functioning properly, you don't really think about it, but when it's not functioning properly, it's really obvious. It's a kind of a big deal. Okay, so that's our cerebellum. Next, there's my picture of the kind of highlighted the cerebellum with those peduncles, the cerebellar peduncles sitting just behind the pons. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the diencephalon. The diencephalon has three parts. It's got the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. So again, the names kind of tell you their position. Epi means above, the thalamus is the thalamus, and the hypothalamus is below. So the epithalamus isn't really much. It doesn't really have a structure to it. It's just kind of the region. So if I were to highlight, the epithalamus is kind of right here. And I've kind of highlighted it right here on the MRI. It contains the region of where the choroid plexus is. Remember, choroid plexus is the capillaries that produce the cerebrospinal fluid. Some also include the pineal gland at the posterior end of the epithalamus. So that could be kind of a regional location. So really it's the roof of the diencephalon. It's kind of the uppermost part of it. You'll find the choroid plexus and the pineal gland associated with the epithalamus, and that's about it. The thalamus is a really busy place, as is the hypothalamus, and we'll get to that. So you'll notice the thalamus is this egg-shaped. It's the circle region that kind of sits right on top of the midbrain. There's two thalamic lobes. They're kind of like this, and with the third ventricle in the middle between the two. And I like to describe the thalamus as like an executive secretary, right? The president of your brain is the cerebrum, the conscious thinker, right? They have to make those conscious decisions. Just like a CEO or president of a company has to make the big decisions. However, the president does not need all of the information of every single worker that's working for the company. So then you get that as executive secretary or assistant that then can filter the information that's coming in from the company and only present to the CEO the information that's most needed of their attention. So think about that's what the thalamus is. So all of this information is coming in from the spinal cord, from the lower parts of the brain, the cerebellum, the brainstem, the hypothalamus. It's getting visual information also, or hearing information and the sensory information from your cerebrum, and it's processing that and then only allowing certain bits of that information to go up to the cerebral cortex for the actual processing of conscious information. So we can see in our diagram, we're getting information from the basal nuclei. Again, we haven't talked about that yet, but we will. We're getting information from the cerebellum, general sensory, vision, auditory. So all of this information is coming in to the thalamus, and then it relays it up to different areas of the cerebrum, like the association area of the cerebral cortex, the parietal lobe, the frontal lobe, and the limbic system. So information comes in, and then it forwards on what is needed for conscious awareness. The two regions that you need to know from the thalamus, you don't have to memorize all of the different groups and what goes in and what goes out specifically, except for these two combinations. Okay, so visual input goes into what we call the lateral geniculate nucleus, and auditory input goes into the medial geniculate nucleus. The reason why I'm asking you to learn those now is because we're going to see them again in special senses when we talk about hearing and vision and the pathways that that information stops over before it goes to our cerebral cortex. So just remember that. Otherwise, the thalamus is this relay station that all this information comes in, but only certain information makes its way to your conscious awareness. We have a good activity of that in lab when we do sensations in lab. All right, so that is the thalamus of the diencephalon. The other really busy place of the diencephalon is the hypothalamus. It sits below and anterior to the thalamus. So if I were to draw, so epithalamus would kind of be right here, thalamus is right here, hypothalamus is like this funnel shape, kind of sitting anteriorly. So the hypothalamus has a whole lot of nuclei in different regions, and you can kind of see that information in table 14.6. I think that's a recent number table. So we'll just go through those very quickly, and they have the color-coded picture right here, but again, you don't have that distinction in an actual brain. They just know that these are about the regions that these nuclei are going to be found, and they can test them to figure out what they do. The major anatomical features, though, that you can see would be the mammillary body, because that sticks out pretty obvious. And the pituitary gland is going to sit right here. So that's been cut on this. So the pituitary gland is very obvious, and the mammillary body. So here's your pituitary gland, here's your mammillary body, these two bumps. And right anterior to the mammillary body, or sorry, the pituitary gland, is another landmark that you should become familiar with, is the optic chiasm. So those three things can be a good landmark for when you're identifying different parts of the brain, because they just kind of stick out. They're pretty obvious. Okay, so let's go through these different functions of the hypothalamus. So we have the mammillary body. Okay, so mammillary body is a collection of neurons that control your feeding reflexes. So swallowing, licking, movement of your tongue in your cheeks, excuse me, while you're eating. Okay. We have autonomic centers, synaptic or sympathetic and parasympathetic. So these we're going to see a lot more in chapter 16 when we talk about fight or flight, which is our sympathetic, and rest and digest, which is our parasympathetic. So they are coordinated and dominated in the hypothalamus. This is their base of operations, if you will. Okay. The next area is the tuberal. Tuberal area is just this little flat part between the mammillary body and the infundibulum, which is the stalk that goes out to the pituitary gland. The tuberal area helps with hormonal control of the pituitary, the anterior lobe. We'll see that in chapter 18. So it's more of an endocrine function. Supra-optic nucleus, supra, above, optic, optic chiasm, supra-optic nucleus, right here. It's a little green guy, boop, sitting right above the optic chiasm. The supra-optic nucleus secretes a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, helps to regulate your water balance with your kidneys. We're going to see that more in all the chapters. Specifically in chapter 18, but we'll see it in 20 and 21 and 25 and 26 and 233. So ADH is a really important hormone. All right, so paraventricular nucleus. So paraventricular, because it's next to the ventricles, secretes oxytocin, which is another hormone that has other functions. We're going to see that in chapter 18. Preoptic. So preoptic is before So, right, so here's preoptic, kind of sits anterior to some of those optic pathways. This is your body's thermostat. So if you remember way back in 231, talking about homeostasis and negative feedback, and we use thermoregulation as an example, where your body temperature, your gauge, maintains your 98.6 or 37 degrees Celsius. That regulator is your preoptic area of your hypothalamus. It is your thermostat. So when you have a fever, that cranks up a little bit, saying, okay, so instead of being at 98.6, I want to be at 101. So you start to shiver because that is your skeletal muscles. We know skeletal muscles produce heat, heats up the body, brings your whole body up to 101 because that's what your preoptic says it's supposed to be. And you have a fever. You take medicine, it re-gauges that back down to 98.6, or the fever breaks and it goes back naturally. All right, lastly, suprachiasmatic. Suprachiasmatic, again, sitting above the optic chiasm. There's supraoptic and suprachiasmatic, both right next to the optic chiasm. This plays a part in your day-night cycles, so that should let us know that it's going to have a connection with your reticular formation and probably also your pineal gland, which we'll talk about in the endocrine system. Whew, hypothalamus is a busy, busy place, and we will see the hypothalamus come in later in the limbic system as well as your autonomic, chapter 16, autonomic nervous system. All right, make sure I'm covering everything in my notes here. Got all those things. Okay, so I think I've got a picture. Yes, just my MRI picture of the hypothalamus. So again, the full diencephalon would be all of this with the epithalamus kind of right here. The thalamus is that egg-shaped thing right here, and then hypothalamus is right here. Okay, so next time we will cover, the next video will cover limbic system and the cerebrum. I will see you next time. Bye.